So, to continue in English, welcome everybody to this session of Meet the Author, the final one of the season. And it's a great pleasure to have Louisa Young with us. Thank you for coming, Louisa.
Pleasure.
Yeah. And so Louisa has been a woman of letters for quite a long time now, 25 years or so at least.
Oh, at least.
Yeah.
At least.
And she's done all kinds of different sorts of writing. And we'll talk about some of that going on. She's a novelist originally. Well, she's been writing for adults, but she had a period when she was with her daughter writing kids' books. And she's done a lot of journalism. She's written some non-fiction books. She's also a songwriter and has dabbled in theatre with Teatro di Complicité, the legendary British company. Yes. So she's a Renaissance woman, woman of letters, and it's a great pleasure to welcome her to our library. But as is our normal pattern here with the Meet the Author, we'll start by focusing on a particular book, and the one we chose was My Dear, I Wanted You to Know. And to get it started, I'm going to ask Louise to not open completely randomly, but choose a bit to read to us.
It'd be quite fun to do it randomly, wouldn't it? Let's see, where do we land? Peter sat in his chair. No, I'm not going to read that bit. I'm going to read you a bit. Right, the book, My Dear, I Wanted to Tell You. It sounds like a very soppy romantic title. It's actually taken from if you got very badly wounded in the First World War, you would be taken to a casualty clearing station and you would be offered a pre-printed postcard that you could send to your parents or your wife or whoever it was, because if you wrote them a letter, it would have to go through censors, and this could take up to 6 weeks. So they would give you a card, and the card says, "My dear, ... So you fill it in, you know, Mum, Edith, whatever. I wanted to tell you before any telegram arrived that I have received a slight - severe wound in my ... And I was at the Wellcome Foundation in London, and I saw one of these cards and it hadn't been filled in. And opposite it was a photograph of a young man who'd had his face half blown away. And he looked about 22. And you think, okay, you're 22 years old, you're sitting in a casualty clearing station somewhere on the Western Front, and you've got to send this card to your mother. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to lie, obviously. You're not going to write saying, "Dear Mum, I've received a severe wound in my face." You know, who could say that? You're going to say, "I've received a slight wound in my stiff upper lip and everything is going to be fine," because soldiers don't talk about their trauma. They didn't then, they often still don't now. So I just looked at that empty card and I looked at that photograph and I thought, well, you know, if ever there was an incipient novel, it's right there. There's my character. Here is his story. There are the gaps which I can fill in. So that was the origin of this book. And the bit I'm going to read is a bit where my dear hero, whose name is Riley Purefoy, came back from the war, having lost his jaw and having had it rebuilt by an actual historical surgeon. His name is Harold Gillies, who my grandmother, as it happened, worked with. She was a sculptor, so she would make plaster casts of the wounded faces, and then part of the very complicated process of rebuilding a face in 1917 would be made easier because the surgeons could work on the model rather than on the actual traumatized soldier. So Riley comes home, he's got a vulcanized rubber jaw and his skin taken from the top of his head and arteries replaced, and he can't talk really, and he's very much in love with the girl that he's told he's run away with, a woman in Paris, because he doesn't want to stay with him out of pity. So, you know, everything's a bit of a mess, but he goes to Wigan to visit the widow of his dear friend who died. So I'm just going to read the bit where he's just been Right, he got into a fight in the pub because the landlord thought he should ask for his drink properly like a human being, and obviously he couldn't. I know it was the barman, but the landlord, Mr. Sutton, from the Swan and Railway, joined them for supper and told stories of Jack's boyhood and their times together at the railway coach builders. Sybil gave Riley his food beforehand on his own, and he thanked her for the courtesy. The children stared. They warmed up after Riley sketched each of them in his notebook and tore the pictures out to give them. Young Annie was very like her father. It's very good, she said. It looks just like me. She looked at him. But I can't see what you look like. Why have you your scarf on at supper? Sybil didn't tell her to hush, though Alice did. Riley put his finger up to ask them to wait a moment, and he scribbled her a note. She read it out loud. I was hurt badly at the Battle of Passchendaele. Oh, yes, I know that one. And now my face is very frightening, so I cover it up. She stared over at him. Is it really, really frightening? He nodded. Is that why you don't talk? He nodded. Have you not got a mouth anymore? He kind of shrugged. Can I see? Annie, cried Alice. Little Arthur stared, agog with appalled hope. Sybil was silent, watching. Mr. Sutton said, oh, dear God, trying. Annie turned and said, don't swear, Uncle. Then can I see? She asked again. Her face was kind and curious. Riley looked at Sybil. It's up to you, she said. You can't shelter the little ones too much. Riley looked pensively at Annie, 8 years old, her father's daughter. Then he wrote, if it gives you nightmares, you can come and kick me in the morning. And remember, I have a very pretty heart. She read it out and laughed and settled down to stare at him. The others were motionless, except for Mr. Sutton, who started refilling his pipe. Alice looked at the table. Riley unwrapped his face. Silence of anticipation. There, my half-healed face, naked in a room of strangers. Such handsome eyes, thought Sybil. The expression in those eyes, the fear, the apologetic concern for the feelings of those looking, the expectation of revulsion, all filled her with tenderness towards him. The eyes transfixed her before she saw the rail of scars, the crooked, still swollen jawline, the strange rebuilt mouth. Poor lad, thought Mr. Sutton. Dear God, no wonder Bert dropped a glass. Ugh! Cried Arthur, fascinated, and only 6. Alice shushed him and would not look. Little Sybil's mouth was wobbling. Riley glanced at her sadly, and Alice smiled at him with a tiny gulp and took her out into the kitchen. They could hear as she started to howl. That is quite scary, said Annie in an observational tone. She squinted at it and moved around to look at it from the side. I quite like it, though. Can I touch it? Riley felt the tightness across his cheekbones again, a little snort of utterly unexpected laughter, trying to find a place to go. He nodded and watched until she went out of focus as she came up close and carefully prodded different places on his face. But you have got a mouth, she said. I bet you could talk. He said, da. She grinned. See, she cried, you must take honey and hot water and whiskey for your throat. He reached round for the notebook. She passed it to him, and he wrote, the surgeon at the hospital made me a new jawbone out of rubber and brought the skin from my head to cover it. They're going to get me teeth. They say I might be able to chew and eat again. I think I'll always be a messy eater, though. Arthur was a messy eater, Annie said kindly. He grew out of it. He practiced eating tidily because Mum said to. Did they cut you and stitch you? Yes. Do you remember, Mum? They did that to Jean's dad after the fire at the engine house. Arthur and Mr. Sutton were still staring. Sybil said, they did that, Annie. It's clever how they can do that, Annie said. And it's not that frightening, you know. I suppose because your eyes are kind. His pupils shrank away, tiny, black in the grey fields. He blinked several times. Then he groped for his notebook. Sybil passed it. Riley wrote, "Thank you. What you have said makes me feel much better about my face." She read it, smiled at him, jumped up and patted his cheek. "Best do the dishes now," she said.
It's a key moment in the book when I think Riley starts to understand it can be possible again to live in the world. Because for a while he couldn't.
Yeah. Always makes me cry, that bit. It's been what, 12, 14 years since I wrote it.
Yeah.
And oh my God, that little girl, she's so sweet. That poor guy, oh God. I haven't actually read it for a while, so been remembering what it's all about.
Yeah, well, I mean, who are the ones actually read the book? We've got some, one, two, a bit. Yeah. I do recommend it. It's simultaneously a page turner. It's got quite a lot of conventional narrative structure to it. It definitely tells a really good and interesting story. But at the same time, it's dealing with some really, really big themes. And in places, the writing is very bold and experimental, which is fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's bits where
it's also the first of a trilogy, just worth mentioning.
Yeah.
Because in this one, we have the wounded soldier coming home. I've never been very interested in battle scenes and fight scenes and car chases. I like a nice aftermath. So for me, it's about the healing of someone who literally can't talk, because the whole thing, Daddy never talked about the war. You can't tell people what you did when you've been to war, because if you do, you destroy the thing you're trying to protect, i.e. the innocence of the people who stayed behind, or the sanctity of your society, whatever it means to you and to them. And that has always been the case and always comes around again. So in this one, it was specifically about his face and his speech. The second one deals more with the leader of the group that he was in, and not Anthony Beaver, can't remember the names of military levels, but who basically drank himself into oblivion, and this relationship with his wife. Since 1919, it's called The Hero's Welcome. And it's just about that thing of when broken people come home and are insane because of what they've been through and what they've had to do. And the people who are so delighted with them being so brave and bold and violent and male out there on the battlefield, suddenly they're back in the sitting room with their cup of tea, and nobody wants them to throw their cup of tea against the grand piano. And yet it's all still there. And then book 3, which is called Devotion, takes the same family and the same group of people, links them up with Italian cousins in Rome. And it's set partly in the Jewish community in Rome during the 30s, and specifically about fascist Jews. So in every book that I write, there is some phrase which just gets me, and I think, hello, what? What was that? And fascist Jews, obviously it's one of those phrases, you don't hear that the whole time. But, it's the 30s, it's Italy, it's there. And so again, it's one of those things, there's this novel there just waiting to be written. And it ends on the just at the beginning of the Second War, when all the kids of the people who made it back from the First War are just old enough to be sent off to the Second one. Perfect timing.
I mean, it's interesting. You said that you're not interested in writing battle scenes particularly, but one of the many things that you achieve wonderfully in this book is that you take us right into the battle in the trenches, and Passchendaele and Somme, all the rest of it. And it's just off stage, because what's on stage is the effect of this atrocious, impossible, disastrous, stupid, mechanized violence on a bunch of men and then women. And that's essentially what the book's all about.
Exactly.
And I think because it really goes into the psychological and emotional experience of a bunch of decent people who've got caught up in this thing.
Yeah.
And the men in the front line, but then the women also very close to front line, because a couple of them go across to be nurses in the field stations. And then the ones left behind dealing with the wounded soldiers coming back and all the rest of it. And then the emotional wreckage, which goes with it. I mean, the actual action of the war is only sketched in the background, but it's incredibly present without being described in detail.
Yes, I think that's true, because for me, the reality of war, I mean, I studied history at university, and God knows we did plenty of war and we did plenty of politics. And my response to all these sort of passing of bills and winning of battles was always, yeah, but what happened to the individuals? What was actually going on? Where were the women? Where were the children? Where were they getting the food from? What happened after the hospital was destroyed? Where did they take the people who'd been in the labour ward or wherever it is? Of course, that stuff is very difficult to get your hands on when you're reading the books about, you know, the military strategies, or, you know, which politician made what speech. And so I'm always wanting to get to, I mean, one of the lines which was always going through my head is, yeah, but what about her? Where was she? Because we hear so much about the men, and certainly, you know, kind of almost historical now when I was studying history. But I hope things have changed a bit. But equally, just where are the individuals? You know, these guys who win this war, when they're, you know, and I'm old enough to remember guys on the streets in London, you know, selling things off trays, you know, the old blokes with one leg, and they didn't look very happy, and they didn't, you know, their clothes weren't very clean. And I think, oh, those poor old guys, I wonder why they've only got one leg. You know, this is like 1962 or whatever, 65.
And you know, as I was reading, I was thinking, you didn't know this when you wrote it, but this theme is suddenly terribly current again, because
Absolutely,
our lucky generation thought we'd invented the perpetual European peace. Well, that didn't work out so well. At the moment, it's in East Europe, but it's super close to home. And you know what's going on in the Ukraine right now is just another really vile, stupid, destructive.
absolutely,
war,
and
hurting lots and lots of people.
Yeah, and you know, causing all the same collateral damage.
So it's
perfectly normal everyday people.
As I was reading it, this novel is incredibly contemporary in that sense. You know, it's well, back on the agenda. It's no longer historical memory. It's again.
One of the interesting things about doing, I mean, I suppose you would call these books historical fiction. For me, they're just fiction, and they happen to be set in a different period of time. But writing about a period of the past, you've always got an opportunity to look at things in a way which people at that time weren't able to look at it. So it's always interesting. You can look at things like, well, you know, counting women as being important, or you can look at sexuality, and you can look at things which people, you know, at the time you couldn't mention, or if you did mention, people would label you or put you in a particular place or put you in prison or whatever it was. So it's nice to be able to have that kind of, what's that word? Hindsight. Hindsight's great. Hindsight's 2020. But at the same time, you see how exactly the same themes are there, which is that people just want to be able to live their life, feed their children, look after their old mum, go home at night, it's there, there's some dinner. That's all people want, basically, whoever you are. And that's what hundreds of thousands of people lose through these political and militaristic machinations.
That's absolutely right. I mean, you say you're not interested in history, but you showing your training as a historian at the great university, that you take a lot of care to get the historical detail fairly accurate. And because that really leads me into another major theme of the book, which is the evolving position of women that occurred at that time. There's an extremely strong generation gap between the mothers and aunties who reached maturity before the war, and then the younger women who are formed under the pressures of the war and emerged with a sort of proto-feminist kind of attitude to things.
Well, there's this wonderful old First World War song, how are you going to keep them down on the farm now that they've seen Paris? And that was originally about, you know, young farm boys going off like, oh my God, abroad. It's different. It's amazing. You can do things beyond feeding the pigs. But it also applies to women that, you know, when they've been and worked in the factories, it's like, no, I don't want to be your housemaid anymore. Thank you very much. I want to make £2.50, you know, being poisoned with the chemicals that I'm putting into the bullets, you know, whatever it might be. And all sorts of opportunities opened up, which were then closed again because, of course, women had to go home because the men need the jobs. And, you know, obviously women don't need jobs. They just need to marry men and do as they're told. But, you know, that carried on.
Really?
It was a little while. Absolutely. But, you know, the spirit was still there. It was squashed a bit. Second World War, you know, 6 years of actually, yes, women's contribution is massively important. And then, you know, just
It takes a while for
carry on.
It takes a while for real feminism to start emerging.
It'd be great, wouldn't it?
I think there's been a bit of progress since 1918.
Oh God, absolutely, absolutely. Bit of lack of progress this week as well, really a little bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, never mind that.
Years and months. Yeah. I'm always happy to have people who here contribute. So if any of you who read the book have a particular comment or question you'd like to bring in, then please do so. I'll give you the microphone, then the people on Zoom can.
I'm afraid I haven't read the book, but I have two questions. They're both related. And the first one is, I'm sure you had to do research to find out exactly how they did construct the faces.
Yeah.
And Pat Barker wrote a book, I can't think of the name of it, about the tin faces that they you originally used, and how frightening even the tin face was. The mask was terribly frightening. And so I wondered what you researched, I think that's one step later. The face that you described is not I think the tin was what came first, and then they came
well, there you'd be wrong. The first example of facial reconstructive surgery, 3,000 years ago, India, and there are Vedic documents describing how if you lose your nose, and basically there are 3 ways that you lose your nose. One is leprosy, one is syphilis, and the other is somebody chops it off you, which is either because you've been shagging their wife or because you broke the law and it was. So basically you want to have a nose. If you don't have a nose, it means that you're a bad person. Either, you know, you're maybe going to pass on leprosy, or maybe you're just, you know, a terrible sexual runaround, or you're a criminal. Anyway, you want a nose. So there is this extraordinary paper written 3,000 years ago describing how you need to get a twig or a quill, which you position there to replace the bones. And then they cut a sort of little fan of skin, but just to there, because you have to keep an attachment of skin between the brows because you want to take the blood vessels down. Because if you just cut off a piece of skin and put it over a wound, it'll just die and fall off. But if it's got a blood supply, the skin will live. So you just twist it round, pop it into place over a twig, sew it up, you've got a nose. So that principle moved across, it moved west from India, it landed, it came through the present-day Iran and Arabia, landed in Sicily, where they did quite a big thing of it in the 14th to 15th centuries, and it's recorded, and ended up, of course, in Bologna, where they decided that rather than take it from the forehead, they were going to try taking it from the arm. And there's a beautiful illustration of a guy with his arm strapped to his face, and they built this sort of jacket to hold his arm in place on his nose. Anyway, so come the First World War, and literally it had to be like that for 3 months. Anyway, so come the First World War, people, because they had this never-ending supply, and in Germany and on European mainland were French, Belgian, Dutch, German surgeons also working on this. But our big surgeon in Britain was this New Zealand Scot, Harold Gillies, who went to the Western Front and saw that people were getting these head injuries, partly because actually British soldiers in the trenches didn't get helmets until 1915. So you're in your trench. Oh dear, get your head shot to bits. So a lot of otherwise very healthy young men, desperate because there's nothing else you can do with these things. So it was like, well, do you want us to try and mend your face? And they would go, yeah. And it was extremely complicated and difficult. But Gillies came up with this idea that you could get the skin, but if you kept if the issue was the blood supply, so you needed, you know, at least a vein and an artery. Well, what about if you took the skin from here and then you took a long strip and you brought the blood vessels out, and then so rather than have your arm here, you could just have a longer connection. And then how about if you cut it from the top of your head, just swung it down like a hammer, and literally they would have, oh, we could do it like this, we could do it like this, which is where my grandmother came in, because they were designing it on the back of a fag packet, and she was making a model of the particular face and the particular injuries. And they were saying, great, let's look, because if this is 2 inches and that's 3 inches, so we'll need, you know, that much skin and da, da, da. And they'd sort of place it on the model rather than tormenting the poor guy who's off his head on morphine and has had his wound reopened, because you can't operate on healed flesh. You have to, so they had to have it re-broken, re-damaged, then mended, then heal up again. And you're lying there in Sidcup in a hospital made of tents with all these Kiwis and genius surgeons just making it up as they go along, but giving you a chance of a life. So for the surgeons, the tin faces were a sign of failure. To have the metal masks, like masks are no good because you can't do anything. Because apart, you know, what else do you do with your face apart from appear? Is, you know, you eat, you talk, you see, you smell, you smile, you express yourself, and you feed yourself, and you relate to people. And if you've got a tin mask on with your painted eye, yeah, you know, it may look all very beautiful, which it does, and it may mean that you can walk down the street without people fainting. But then if somebody actually looks at you and tries to talk to you, what can you do? You can't. Whereas at least if you've been sewn up, maybe you can. Maybe it will be difficult, as Riley finds in that scene. Nobody's saying it's easy, but maybe it's, you know.
Are you saying though that the tin came after the?
Well, if you go back to the you know, to the Indian thing, to 3,000 years ago, in that sense it did. There were different roles. There were different people doing different things at the same time, and people coming up with, oh, we can do this, and then somebody would go from one hospital to another. And what was absolutely fascinating was the fact that, you know, when the doctors got together, the surgeons got together after the war, and were able to talk to each other about what they'd done for their, oh, because we had a guy with that kind of wound and we did this, well, we did that. Like, oh, brilliant. And then, of course, medicine does what it likes to do, which is everybody work together. I mean, the French, there was a very famous French surgeon, and he learned his stitching techniques from the lace makers in northern France, because those were the people who knew precisely how to stitch. And, you know, so, and a lot of dentists involved. There was one guy who had a chair in the back. He had a converted Rolls Royce with a dental chair in the back, and he was driving around around the front doing dental services for the, you know, officers, basically. And he got roped in, like, you know, teeth are an important part of it as well.
We've got a question from Monica in a minute, but I just want, before we go there, just to tell the people on Zoom that we're rigged up in such a way you probably can't talk to us, but you certainly can put something in the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf if you want to get
Hello,
involved.
People on Zoom.
Hi, Zoom people.
Wherever they are. Hello, people on Zoom.
Monica.
I love the book. Thank you for putting that out there in the world for us. You mentioned that, you know, obviously you've been knee deep in like wartime history and writing the trilogy and everything. So I imagine you read tons and tons of primary documents and sources. And now with this, you know, a longer view, perhaps something less specific than tin masks, although very fascinating. And I love that too. But what important lessons do you think an astute reader or student of history can still take from World War I?
Oh my God, that's a big one.
You just like go anywhere you want with that. No, but especially with, as Simon mentioned, as you mentioned, with everything in Ukraine, right? I mean, it's very current again. What if we could remember, what should we remember from that?
Well, I mean, you just have to take it back even further. One of the things that was very, very popular among particularly the officers, but not only, at the time was Homer. People would read the Odyssey, and they would read about, you know, the Spartans, and they would read about the way that the Spartans after battle would go into a field and shake. They'd do the shedding, and they would, you know, get rid of their tension and their fury and all the blood chemistry and everything, which they didn't necessarily have those names for, but it was the same thing. And they would read about Odysseus coming home from war. What did he do? He took 10 years, and he spent 7 of them on an island taking magic potions with a witch. Sounds quite a lot like sex and drugs and rock and roll to me. And when you take into account the number of people who die in war, so you think about, you know, the military casualties, and then if you add to that the number of people who served in that war who die in the following 10 years of alcoholism, drug addiction, mysterious car crashes, and identifiable suicides, it almost doubles. And this figure stands for almost every war that there are proper figures for. And that has not changed, because Odysseus left Troy with what, 10 ships? And we think of him as a great hero. How many of his men did he actually get home? His own self. So the lesson from the First World War is the same lesson that we have from the Trojan War, and that the stories are all very well, but the destruction and that thing of it taking 10 years, because if you look at we were talking about that today, actually, about whether after wars you get the creative flowering, and we're thinking, when's it going to happen, the sort of post-COVID creative flowering through shared trauma, etc. But it normally comes kind of about 10 years afterwards. So if you look at what was published in 1928, for example, phenomenal array of work by people who either served or their families did, or their husbands didn't come back, or whatever it may be. So it's the same lesson. Don't do it. But unfortunately, people who need to learn the lesson don't care about that. I don't know, they're structured in some different way. They feel that they're protecting things and defending things, and they're consumed by fear or desire or an addiction to power. And I don't understand those people, and I think they probably don't understand me. And they probably say, calm down, dear, we're protecting you so you can have your little life writing your little novels.
Cue one of the less edifying moments during the united Brexit process, which was when the vote hadn't been taken, the campaign was going on. I found myself having dinner in Warsaw with the MEP from Leicestershire. And she said right at the beginning of the dinner, I think you should know that I'm a Brexiteer. I said, okay, let's have the conversation. And she went through all the usual stuff. And then towards the end, I said, but what about the European Peace Project? Isn't that worth keeping? And do you know what she said? She said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. I rest my case. We've been led by donkeys again, I'm afraid.
It's an interesting thing, those MEPs, because normally, if you join into something and your express purpose is to destroy that thing will sort of recognize it and acknowledge it and think, actually, you're not on our side, so we're going to kind of try and get rid of you. But because of little nice habits of good manners and democracy, it seemed not to be possible. I mean, because if you're a company, you think you're an industrial spy, you're just here because you want to destroy our company. But because of the way that it worked, but they did it on purpose, like woodworm. Horrible.
Soggy Island is now paying the price, big time. Whatever. We won't go all political. My views on Brexit are well known. So returning to literature, when is literature not political? Wonderful. No, that's another question. I was also interested in the way you structured in the book the pairing and dualities of some of the characters. So, for example, amongst the two of the women who stayed back, you've got Rose, who's the hardworking woman who's not conventionally beautiful and believes herself to be unmarriable, and life has taught her that. And then her relative by marriage Julia,
Mm.
who's the opposite end of the spectrum, believes the only thing she can be is beautiful.
Mhm.
And that's all she can offer. And of course, the Rose is incredibly active and capable and does things and looks after people and solves problems. And Julia can't even look after her own child.
Mhm.
That's a sort of duality. And then the sort of the pairing that the main love couple, Riley and Nadine, have to go through parallel journeys of the war experience to, in a sense, arrive at a point where they can be mature enough to actually find the life together.
Yeah, it looks quite. It sounds quite geometrical.
It does. And the other one at the end, and it's a bit of a spoiler, I'm afraid, but the two faces are destroyed at the end.
Yeah, yeah. But
that-
again, that's
that
the thing
pulls
where you
things
start
together.
when you start researching. So
Yeah.
what Simon's referring to there is poor Julia, who has been brought up in a very particular way. Her job is to be beautiful. Her job is to marry a man and keep him very happy by being very beautiful and very sweet and nice. And so she's desperate to do this. Unfortunately, her husband is off his head and permanently drunk because he led a battalion where they died. And so he's just reciting their names in his head and can't deal with the fact that he wasn't as good an officer as he was meant to be, and he didn't do what he was meant to do, i.e. kill the other people, not let his people. And he can't take it. He's a perfectly intelligent, sensible person. I don't think any of us, I think it's a miracle anybody comes back from any kind of war situation sane. And then Julia is like, oh, he doesn't love me, I'm not pretty enough, I must be prettier, this will solve the problem. If I can only make everything kind of look better and be a better wife, I will be more comfort to him. So she goes off and uses this thing called it's a sort of paraffin wax that they used. So they used it on the Western Front. Soldiers would inject it into their legs so that they would get horrible ulcers and could then get sent back to Blighty. At the same time, a different kind of surgeon altogether would use it to inject into ladies' faces as an early form of filler, basically. And there was a very famous lady called spelt Gladys, pronounced Gladys Deacon, who was married to the Duke of Marlborough. And she decided she wanted the perfect profile, which she decided was a very classical line with no dip between, in the top of your nose. Most of us have a little dip. She wanted the straight line. So she got a professor of aesthetics to go around the Louvre with her, looking at all the classical statues, get the exact profile. Then she went and got somebody to inject this wax into her face. And she had this marvelous profile. And everything, oh, ladies, you're so beautiful, you're so classical. And then, of course, it started to melt and drip. And meanwhile, the soldiers who'd injected it into their legs were getting a kind of cancerous tumor, a paraphenoma. And, don't inject chemicals into you. And ladies ended up with 25 small dogs living in Blenheim Palace with all this wax, which, some horrid journalist went to visit her in the 1930s and said that she was sitting by the fire trying to push the wax. Utter horror story. But so the echoes and reflections from one type of plastic surgery, which is what they were doing to the men's faces, to what Julia felt she had to do, because wounds aren't just physical, we all know that. And so I wanted to make a full tour of all the dreadful things that could happen.
Okay, so any more questions about the book? You want to add something? Yeah.
Sorry, this is a slightly personal question. My husband's doing a DPhil at the moment at Oxford, and he's actually studying First World War, specifically related to the nobility. So I wondered if you had any sort of statistics about the suicide issue.
I don't know specifically about the suicide issue. And if by the nobility, we sort of British aristocracy, the young gentlemen, all I know is that a higher proportion of officers died than did men of the ranks. And mostly the officers, it's entirely, to begin with, at least it was class-based. And, they'd been fed this particular myth of their duty, and you know, they did it. All over by Christmas, playing fields of Eton, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you think they're 19 or 20 years old. I mean, I used to be 19 or 20. I know 19-year-olds. I mean, Jesus.
Famous story of a brother of a duke who was training officers before they went to war in World War One, and one of the chaps fumbled and dropped a grenade with the pin out. So instantaneously, this chap just went straight over it and absorbed and died. It was just instant. That was what you had to do.
To prevent other people being killed by it. Yeah. Well, you know, that is honourable. Where does it lead us? I mean, it's unspeakable, isn't it? That someone who would do that, or that somebody would be bred to think that they had to do that. I'd love the idea of somebody having, I don't know what we do, have a croquet mallet. Not get across to the other side, kill the bloody foreign. But again, it just doesn't, I find it so difficult to compute in any way why, as a species, we still, after all the marvelous things that we've done and thought and written and created and all the solutions that we have to anything, and yet it is, isn't it? It is.
Yeah, it's again because, you know, Louisa, you and I are the baby boomers, the lucky generation who lived for a long time in peace and prosperity. But of course, it hasn't been like that all over the world. There's been plenty of shit shows happening in other parts of the world, but we've just been lucky. So something in the human animal, the tribal instincts, whatever they are, drive us to these extraordinarily weird, violent episodes. About what? About ideological things, about notions of identity. It's sometimes about you know, survival, but often it isn't. It usually isn't. It's about ideas. It's very strange, and it's such a sort of dark side to the creativity you're referring to. So a necessary subject for creativity, I think. Yeah. Always
has been. Probably always will be.
Yeah, I mean, hence your references to Homer and all the rest of it. Yeah. For sure. Okay, well, thanks a lot for this really significant contribution to that tradition.
Thank you.
And I look forward myself to reading the sequels, which takes up the second novel.
Yeah.
Are there going to be further editions?
It's a curious thing because I don't know. I mean, I first came across this facial reconstructive surgery when I wrote my first book, which was a biography of my grandmother, the sculptor who I was talking about. She was also the widow of Captain Scott of the Antarctic, which is why they allowed me to write a biography of her. My last book, but one, was about my fiance, who was an alcoholic and who had throat cancer and had surgery for his cancer, which was based on the surgery used in My Dear, I Wanted to Tell You. And people thought that I'd written this book after he'd had his surgery, but in fact, I wrote the book beforehand. And then my most recent book is a sort of romance about ghosts, because my boyfriend and I are both widows. And so we used to, you know, we'd be out for a meal and we'd be talking about our late departed beloveds. And wouldn't it be funny, like, you know, we'd love to have a sort of double date because, like, they sound great. And so I thought, all right, I'll do matchmaking ghosts, where they're kind of trying to get us together, only, you know, not us and not them, but as a thing of, you know, a way of writing more happily about something which was very tragic. But the way that books feed into each other is always a bit of an amazement and any writer will tell you that there's a string of stuff. And people look at my books and think, oh, children's novels, oh, thrillers about a belly dancer in Egypt, oh, Life of Your Grandmother Who is Married to Captain Scott, oh, Death of Your Alcoholic Beloved. You know, what, they're all over the place. What is this? What kind of writer is this woman? And in fact, I've worked it out, they're all about love and death. And it's that simple. It's just love and death going through in all sorts of different roles.
Interesting family antecedents you have there.
Oh God, that's
your
not.
grandfather was Scott of.
Well, he wasn't actually my grandfather. He was her first husband. If he hadn't died, I wouldn't be here.
All right. But that was some pretty good starter in
Oh,
Love and Death there.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, I know you come from an established family in UK, and there's other writers in the family.
Mhm.
So when did the whole writing? Did the family create the circumstances for you to become a writer in some
I
way?
wrote my first book when I was 6
So,
in a little blue notebook, and a little stubby pencil. It was about a mouse who lived on a houseboat. His name was Wilbur. No, it wasn't. It was Wilfred. Ah, God, I got his name wrong. My own character. Anyway, it was terrible. But you know, there you go. And then you get this idea, I'm going to be a writer. And so when I was about 22, I got a typewriter and a bottle of whiskey and thought, I can be Raymond Chandler now, and everything will be fine. And obviously not. But yeah, I always thought it looked like a really, really nice thing to do.
And were you always writing, regardless of whether you were writing?
Yeah. And I was a journalist for quite a long time, which is good because then you can kind of practice, and then you get bored and you want to go deeper. And so I did that.
So what is the relationship between your fiction writing and your non-fiction writing? How does that play out?
Oh God, it's as with anything, you get ideas and you have to work out what they're going to be. I mean, like if you've got a line and you think, I know that's not poetry. Is it a song lyric? Is it a chapter title? Is it an image which is actually going to become something else? So you've got all the stuff from your life, and most of life you can't write down because it doesn't make any sense. And fiction has to make sense. You have to give it a pattern. So you fictionalize stuff, but sometimes it doesn't seem true in the right way. Fictional truth and actual truth are completely different. So you work it out. I mean, after a while, it becomes fairly clear what belongs where.
I've not heard it said quite that way before. So talk a bit more about fictional truth and actual truth being different. How does that work?
Well, people say they don't want to read novels because they're not true, and it's not real. Well, no, but if you wrote down what really happened, if you wrote down what people actually say, so you decide, oh, I'm going to be a marvelous new experimental novelist, and I'm going to do this new kind of dialogue that nobody's done before, where I actually have people saying what people say in reality. And I'm actually going to report verbatim how people converse with each other. And so you do that and you think, yes, I'm going to win my Pulitzer. And then you read it and it is absolute incomprehensible garbage that you would not inflict on your worst enemy. And that's the difference. So we all know there's, truth in real life, but half the time you can't face truth. You can't look at it. You're not going to read every 100,000 million words of, an official report on something, all the history ever written about the First World War. You're not going to read it and find a truth that you can digest as a human being. But if somebody gives you a story, the way that, Pat Barker did, or Sebastian Faulks, or me, or whoever, you will, because you've got one person telling you, or a couple of people, you engage in them, you want to know their story, that story is a valid truth and it's digestible. It's not 1 million pages long, it's 300 pages long. Great, you can take it in, you learn from it.
Yes, no works of art are true in the sense of exactly how we get through 24 hours in a day, because you can't do that. And as you're saying that, I was thinking of, like most of you, I imagine I'm near the end now of the epic television program Succession. And Succession has got a very interesting stylistic trick in its dialogue, because pretty much all the characters do it. One of the two are fairly articulate, but the vast majority are spectacularly inarticulate. They're incapable of speaking the whole sentence. And it's full of and yeah, well, yeah, right, yeah, okay, okay, yeah, yeah, and so it's mimicking the sort of incoherence of real.
I can only say that the
speech.
script writers put a lot of work into
But
that.
but it becomes another stylistic trope, because after a while you start noticing it's kind of like everyone's doing it, and it's so it's a kind of thing. But no, so yeah, thanks for that. Obviously, fictional truth is it cannot be the same as lived truth, because it's an artistic response to the experience.
We wouldn't have
being
lifetimes long enough.
Even Mrs. Dalloway is only a guess at what happens in somebody's head during a day. So, Monica, we're going to say something. What, you were stretching.
Like in an auction, don't raise your hand.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think we're maybe getting towards Michelle's just right. Welcome, Michelle. Last saw you, I think, in Melbourne long ago, 20 years ago, maybe. Yeah. I'd like again to open it up if anyone else has got any thoughts or questions that they'd like to bring up. Shout the microphone.
Don't all shout.
I wish I knew your writing career better, but I'll ask this question anyway.
Mhm.
Were you writing journalism and fiction at the same time, in the same year?
Not on the same page.
Not on the same page. No, it's not.
Was I? No,
No.
no, I wasn't. What happened was that I was writing the journalism and that was great. And I was having a severe attack of, is that all there is? And I was about 30, 31. And I thought, I've got to, you know, something's got to happen. And what happened was that I got pregnant and everyone said, oh, well, you'll never be a writer. It's going to be a mother and you've got to, you know, be a mother. And I thought, I don't think so. But that just fed into the thing of, you know, I want more, I've got to do something deeper, I've got to do something bigger. Oh my God, a baby, right, that's huge. But equally, then you know that you have no time at all for writing. So I thought, well, I better write things that really matter. I can't run around being a journalist. I can't go off to, you know, Nashville for 2 weeks or wherever it might be. So I had to stay home. And that was actually when I wrote the biography of my grandmother, because that was something that I could get a publishing deal for because she was an interesting person. And I had her diaries and I said, well, we know this woman can string 3 sentences together because of her journalism. And then when I'd done that, I was like, okay, now the cards are all set up and I can just start making things up.
Yeah, I've been interested in the change in voice because I think journalism is supposed to be reported as if you did not exist. And your novel writing is definitely of a certain person.
Well, it can be, you know, that whole thing of whose voice is doing what. And there are those journalists who make an excellent career by, you know, being themselves and often being quite sort of snarky and sarky and difficult and superior, or by being terribly sympathetic or, you know, that sort of character journalism. I wasn't really one of those, but I was, you know, I did write features. I would go places and interview people, not famous people usually, Christian gang bikers in New Jersey, that kind of thing, women salt miners in Gujarat. So really interesting. And I needed to be a bit present in the stories, but very much to know when to hold back. So when you're writing fiction, you know, one of the first things you have to acknowledge is that obviously you are a character in your story because you are creating it and everything is coming out of your head and your experience. But at the same time, which of your characters in the room, like if I'm writing today, if I'm writing this scene, you know, the opening, here we are in the beautiful library of the British Institute in Florence, and we have all these people. Now, some of these people, I think I might quite like to take the bookseller's point of view of this. What are they thinking? What are they witnessing? What are they expecting? There are people here who know who this strange man is who just arrived. Who is the strange man who just arrived? Some of us know, some of us don't. Some of us might guess. Who's she? I don't know. She's met him before. That's Monica, but I don't know anything about her. So who am I going to be when I write this scene? I think I'll be you. Yeah, I'll write it from your point of view because I don't know anything about you. So, but then, you know, you can leave. You have to be somebody else as well. Or maybe not. Maybe you're writing the first person. Maybe you're moving your point of view around. So it's all part of the tools you get to play with. I recommend it.
Makes it sound really exciting.
It is.
Yeah.
So many options.
Yeah.
Who, what, where, why, when.
Absolutely.
That's like journalism.
Yeah, that's why you keep doing it, isn't it? All right. I think Zoomers, you've been uncharacteristically quiet, and there's nothing in the chat yet. So it's your last chance, and we're going to dissolve this into our traditional glass of wine, which we still haven't figured out how to do virtually. But please do have your glass of wine at home and think of us here in the library and come down and join us whenever you can. But I think unless anyone's got a last question they will share with in the plenary part, we'll move seamlessly into the next bit, which is you go buy your books, and Louisa will sign them.
Yeah,
With the
I will.
dedication. And meanwhile, Sylvia will emerge with some beautiful Frescobaldi wine. Glasses are waiting. We're going to have wine in the room because we're in a small group, so we're going to do the whole thing in this room. And then the conversation goes on. That's how it goes.
Then have questions.
We could even do that. Yeah. Speed read the next two parts of the trilogy, and you might catch Louisa while she's still here. Anyhow, so look, really just to thank Louisa very much indeed for making time to be with us. Nice to have you back in Florence again.
Lovely to be here, and thank you all for coming out.
Yeah.
Hot and lovely evening. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Be my kid.
Yeah.